Hello all, this is Billy Cultist today, and today we're gonna get back into the process of building assets to be used in a future jungle scene. Now as you may remember, the last thing we did in working towards making a jungle was to sculpt out some basic small ground level plant assets that we'll be using to speckle our jungle floor. So this time my intention is actually go up a step and start making some larger trees to actually populate our jungle with what it really needs to be a jungle. What we're probably going to do is go through and work our way down from making very large main trees to smaller sapling-like sized trees. Probably make about 3 trees in this video altogether. And I don't want to spend too much time talking here at the beginning before we actually get into this. But I am aware that Jimmy just recently began a series on setting up logic for a turn-based RPG combat system. And I understand this is a highly popular idea and highly desirable tutorials. So I just want to say before we get going, for any of you who were really anticipating another one of those videos, and may be somewhat disappointed that instead you're getting this, just know that that series is in no way over. We intend to continue giving those kinds of tutorials on that combat system, and in all likelihood the next one's going to come out next weekend. In the meantime, I suggest you think of it this way. If you're building yourself some kind of little JRPG game in Dreams right now, using Jimmy's helpful guide on how to make the combat system, then when everything's said and done, you're probably going to also need environments for that game. So on my end, I'll be showing you how to do that. And I'd say that's about it for little news, trivia, and introductory announcements, so I think we ought to, right now, get into this thing. So the first thing we're going to do straight up is we're going to set up our most biggest primary of jungle trees, the main tree you're going to see around our scene. Before we get started on that, I'm just going to real quick triangle delete this basic square we always got starting out by default in Dreams, because we're not really going to need that, I don't think. And something I like to do, I like to go in, especially when I'm working with props and scaling and stuff, is get into gadgets and just get into gameplay gear and snag a blank puppet deluxe. And this is really just for size referencing scale. It's not going to be permanent. But I'll just stamp that down like so and leave it so we can have something to judge the general size of our tree off of, and detailing and sort of things like that can work off of it. So now first things first, let's open up this, let's go to modes, and let's open up sculpt mode. And right off for making trees, I always like to switch my main tool over from the square to the curve tool over here. That's not to say that it wouldn't be possible to make trees out of any other tool, but I just prefer the curve tool. And another thing I like to do generally, especially when sculpting organic sort of forms, is I'll get into my shape editor with L1 square, and I'll go and set this varying looseness setting to checked on, so that we get a varying looseness and sort of detail over our object, which I kind of like stylistically, but it also helps in optimization terms, generally speaking. And then I'm going to get back out of my shape editor, and right now for my curve tool we happen to be in stamp mode. And generally, again, if I'm working with organic forms like plants or trees, I like to L1 triangle and turn it to smear mode. And I'm going to kind of scale this up to about how thick I would want the base of our big tree to be compared to our puppet. Probably about, roughly like that, I think. And I'm just going to zoom out. And then I'm going to just start smearing the trunk of our big tree, kind of sort of up into the atmosphere of the jungle. Like so. You could go fast or slow, and just gonna bring that up. We kind of got a little wonky on that. Not to worry, I'm just gonna go over here to this side of the puppet and try drawing out another one. We're gonna be zoomed further out. Dreams has this thing where it doesn't really allow you to zoom all the way out till you start expanding the sculpture, so that kind of held us up a bit there. And before I start smearing, I may just decrease the trunk size just a touch. I don't know if we need it quite that wide, but we'll start smearing up again. Wait, may have to do this multiple times. That's not unusual, but just till we get exactly what we think we're liking as far as a look for this jungle tree trunk. So I think that right there is looking pretty nice to my eyes. I think I'm on board with that, and I think I'll just delete the other one with triangle there. Really briefly here, before we get any further into this, I'd like to bring up a question that was asked by an audience member in my last video, relating to why I like to smear using the curve tool instead of, say, just the sphere tool. Because I'll show you here for a second. I'm going to open my shapes real briefly, and I'm going to get the normal sphere out, which is not the curve tool, and we're going to have it on smear, and I'm going to show you real briefly that you can go ahead and just, like so. You can ostensibly, you can do the same thing as I just did with the curve tool set to smear. And we've got kind of a weird wonky sausage made out of spheres. And the thing is, they're relatively the same effect when you do that. But there's one major difference to smearing the curve tool that makes me tend to choose it over this method. It really depends on what you're doing, but generally speaking, I like to do it for trees and organic things, as I said before. And it's the fact that the curve tool actually has a taper ability built into it that the smear sphere tool doesn't seem to have. At least I haven't found any way to do it with that. And the ability to control the taper based on how much pressure you're applying to the R2 button allows you to draw out sculpts in a very similar way to what the paint tool does if you're familiar with the paint tool, the pencil mode in the paint tool. But just demonstrating here really quick, I can get this out and start smearing this curve tool. And as I drag it up, I can slightly decrease the pressure on the R2 button. And as you see, it tapers. It starts to get thinner and thinner, and I can have it just taper into nothing if I want. Very thin like that. And sometimes that's a very cool effect, very organic. I like it a lot. You can't really do that by just smearing a sphere as I did here. But I just wanted to go over that really quick because I thought that was a very good question to ask, and it bears exposure. So I'm just going to delete these things real quick. I'd also like to touch really quickly on another thing that actually came up in the last video. Because in the last video, basically, I demonstrated how, like I have here, if you're using varying looseness and you've got an object that's kind of stretched too thin, like this cube basically, I've flattened it out and stretched it out quite a bit with the varying looseness active, it leaves this kind of big, nasty, gnarly hole in it. And I had said at the time that I really didn't know what could be done about that, other than thickening the object more or just turning off varying looseness entirely. And the same audience member that I mentioned before suggested that you can actually fix this by using Sculpt Mode's tool, which is called, I'm going to get into the tools here, and this right over here, Looseness tool. I activate that, and I'm going to go change the shape reverse to the normal cube. And I'm going to show you that with this tool, you can control basically the looseness of specific parts of the surface of your sculpt. As you can see, I'm putting it over and it's set to a certain looseness, and it forces the sculpt to be that looseness in that area where you brush it. And you can L1 square and enter the brush editor, and you can control how much looseness. Like, there we go, we get bigger flex, a little looser, all the way up. We're getting even looser. But essentially what our good audience member suggested you can do with this, as you see here, you can use it to basically get rid of these nasty big holes that the varying looseness creates in these thin sculpts like this, by just dragging it over and brushing it like so. And as you can see, that works very well to clean that up. So I'd like to say shout out to you, sir, for bringing up that suggestion. And there's something for all of you to keep in your little bag of tricks to help you out with your sculpting. And me as well. I had known about the looseness brush previously. I hadn't really used it that often, but it never came to my head to attempt to use it this way. But I think that's been a very helpful tip-off there. But anyway, back from that little diversion, back into fixing up our actual tree trunk. I think what I'm actually going to do now with our tree is I'm going to actually crop the sculpt and separate it into two sculpts. And I'll explain why I'm doing this. But let's go square here and let's get into tools. I'm going to get the crop tool, I believe, or perhaps the cutout tool would be better. Yeah, I think what we're going to use for this is in fact the cutout tool. So we've got the square. I'm going to modify the brush in the brush editor. We're going to pull it up so it covers our whole tree. Going to make sure it's got everything in there, just like so. And I'm going to bring the bottom up to about so high above the puppet level of our player. And with that, so we don't disarrange anything, I'm just going to quick hit the stamp in place button, and there we got our cutout. And I'm going to exit out of sculpt mode real quick. And as you can see outside sculpt mode, we basically split our tree into two separate sculpt halves. And I'm basically doing this for detail preservation and optimization. I basically used a very similar technique when I created the Winter Woods. If you haven't seen that video about creating the Winter Woods, you might want to check that out. But this is going to allow us to do two things. Get a little more definition down close to the player's eye level on the tree trunk. But also, if need be, we technically have two brand new assets, and so three altogether, in that if we want to, we can take this top part off and we can have just a kind of a broken stump of a tree standing up. Or additionally, we could take this top tree down and stick it in the ground and have a slightly smaller tree in comparison. But now what we're going to do is go to work on adding more detail to these. Quick, I'm going to get in guides here and put on precise move and just move this puppet a little to the side so it doesn't get in the way too much. And I'm going to start detailing this lower trunk segment. I'm probably going to get out the curve tool first, and I'm probably just going to take, let's see, stamp shape. No, I will want it on smear, and I'm going to get in guides, and I'm going to have it surface snap. What I'm going to probably do for starters is just kind of drag this up and down and create kind of a tree-like texture, like with vines or roots or so on running up and down the side of it. So basically something kind of like this. But we're going to time-lapse through that as I do that. Another thing I'm going to do while we're doing this detail work that I often like to do is I'm going to turn on studio lighting here in the guide section of the sculpt mode. Like so we can get good lighting for this all around. And we're just going to continue with time-lapse. You'll notice that I'm now smearing these kind of off of the tree, and I'm still using basically the same tool. Everything's the same. The only thing I did different is I actually turned off surface snap so that I'm able to do this, and it won't snap to the surface like it was doing before. We're going to keep time-lapsing. And I think I've got all that additive detail pretty much where I want it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go in with like some wedges, maybe some cubes, or even cylinders, and I'm going to press triangle and turn them to subtract mode, and I'm just going to kind of go through and start doing some subtractive sculpting and just kind of cutting things away, add a little more detail here and there, some interest to the shape. And I'm going to time-lapse through that as I keep doing that. So now I think we got the bottom half of our jungle tree in pretty good shape, at least. We may have to work on this intermittent area right here where they meet up later. But now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the top, and mainly what we're going to be dealing with up here is the branches. We're not going to do as much detailing on the top area, because number one, there's not as much room. We don't got as big around of a trunk, and this is not at player eye level, so it's not going to matter as much to have so much complexity. So with that being said, I'm going to get into our top sculpt here, and we're going to go ahead and go back to the curve, set it on positive additive setting, and go to smear again. And I'm just going to start smearing out some branches. And something I'd like to say really briefly here about branches as we start working on this is that they can sometimes be kind of tricky in many interesting ways. I like to start at the tip and gradually taper the thing up, and sometimes it takes multiple attempts to get a branch you like the look of. Now, something I'd like to point out here, though, is that when you draw a branch out like this, just freehand in the air, Dreams is going to draw it along your plane of view. So basically from this angle, there's going to be really no bends in the branch whatsoever, which is a little unnatural. Sometimes it's okay, but if every branch is that way, it might not be the greatest, especially depending on what kind of trees or forest you're specifically trying to create. Now, a possible workaround for this is to move the camera around slightly while actually smearing it, but this is very difficult, and I'm going to kind of demonstrate this by trying to do it. You can, like, kind of do this, and you can get a little wiggle there as you make the branch, but there, we kind of got nice organic, but it's a little difficult, and especially if you're not really familiar with Dreams and the way it controls, like the camera and all that. So I'm going to briefly show you a potential easy fix for this. I'm going to first delete this branch, and that one too, why not? And I'm going to get out of sculpt mode, and I'm going to go back into sculpt mode, and we're going to start a brand new sculpt. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale up a square, cube, like that, make it a little flat, like that. Doesn't need to be anything perfect, and we don't need to worry about this as far as detail or any of that or what it does to the thermal, because this is just temporary. I'm going to scale it up quite a bit, like so, stamp it out, and then I'm going to start kind of altering the surface here with, I think, a sphere will work nicely for us. We're going to put it on negative first, and then Something I'll do is I'll kind of turn the blend amount up so we get a little more of a smooth delineation there, and we're just going to kind of rough up the surface in weird ways here. There, shrink it, make it bigger, you know, put it here and there. Do interesting things there with it. And we could also turn it to additive and kind of go that way too, adding things here and there and making it more bumpy. I'll show you what we're doing here in just a second. I'm going to try to use this. It's kind of an easy method of getting ourselves a more unique branch in terms of curvature. Anyway, there we go. We got our really weird surface going on there. I'm going to get out of this sculpt and just leave it where it's at. I'm going to get back into our top tree. We're going to take our curve back. We're going to get on surface snap this time. And as you can see, we're going to snap to that weird surface we created. Get it to about the thickness I want for our branch to maybe be. And we're going to start drawing out another branch. And this time, we're just going to draw... Oh wait, still got it on stamp. Let me fix that. Now it's on smear. I'm going to take a stab at drawing out some branches interestingly on this thing we've got going on here. And hopefully this time we may get some more varied results as far as depth is concerned. I'm going to grab this right now inside the sculpt and move it out so you can see. There we go. We've got some more better depth results than we were having before, just drawing it freehand in midair. And that was relatively easy. Didn't require a lot of really cool acrobatics with the camera to draw that out. Took a little extra time to set up that block, but we have got a good way of making some interesting twisty branches for our big jungle tree. And so I think I'll just continue to use that. And we'll just go about time-lapsing through setting up the branches for the top of this tree. Okay, so we got a nice cluster of branches there at the top of our jungle tree. And in some places it may be a little rough, but I don't think that's going to matter too much since this is a jungle. There's going to be a lot of dense foliage up there, and you're probably not going to see all of it anyway, so that's not going to matter really as much as it even would in, like, say, a winter forest like we created previously. But now, as I said before, what I'm going to do to finalize this is go down here and add a little extra detail to the base and probably detail up the connection between the two, and we'll probably be done after that with the modeling of our tree. So I'm going to just time-lapse through that as I fix that up. Okay, so now I think both halves of our jungle tree are in a reasonable position where we can do a little spray painting on them and generally give them color. So I'm going to go ahead and get back into this one, into its sculpt mode, and we're going to switch over to the spray paint can. I generally like to work with a sphere-shaped brush, so I'm going to get that on. And quick into guides here real quick. We still got surface snap on good. And for color, I'm going to open up the color, and I'm going to start off with kind of a brown like this, but I don't want it to be that dark. I'm going to go into the customizer, and I'm going to pick out something of a light grayish version of that color, like fairly light. Something like that. I'm going to go ahead and use the brush very large and just kind of hit the whole thing. I'm going to go ahead and back out of this bottom sculpt and go ahead and enter the top one and do the same thing. All the way up into the branches. Try to get all of it. Should be able to with the brush this big. And I'm going to go ahead and exit back out. We're going to go back down to the bottom. I'm going to change the shade a little. This is something I generally like to do with just everything in general. Not just organic sculpts. I like to do this with furniture and just about everything. I'm going to lighten the shade just a touch. And as we can see, it's a little bit lighter, and I'm going to shrink this down. Now I'm going to kind of do a little detailing work while I'll just run this generally over raised surfaces as opposed to cracks. I'm going to turn the blend mode up a bit, quite a bit, and shrink it down as necessary, but just kind of like so. Gives it a little extra. I really don't know what it gives it. I just like it. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and I'm going to time-lapse through that as we go. We can adjust the opacity a touch, or the soft blend and opacity in tandem, and we can kind of get a better blend on that's a little softer, but I'm going to time lapse through that as we do that. And so I added that paint to the lower trunk, so let's get out and get into this sculpt, and let's kind of do the same thing. I'm going to time lapse through the upper. So I think the upper's in a good place. I'm going to get back into the lower, and I may just add another extra coat, and I'm going to, this time, darken it up quite a bit from what we had before. Let's see if we got something that's nice and dark. Maybe a little darker than that. Okay, that's about right. I think that'll work, and I'm just going to kind of go in and this time hit some of the more shaded areas, if you will. And we're going to time-lapse as I do that. Probably won't do this part on the upper tree trunk, because there's not as many areas like this. Okay, that's looking pretty nice as far as I can see it. Now, one last coat I'm going to be adding is probably to add some kind of mossy green, because we are in the jungle, and I'd like to, I think, have sort of a layer of moss. So we're going to kind of get a green. I'm going to desaturate it a little, bring it over here just a little bit, and we'll see what we got there. That's kind of good. Leave it nice and blendy. We're going to additionally be going in later and using the paint tool to add some more impastoed cool moss on the surface of this, but for now let's go ahead and time-lapse through the painting process on this. Okay, so now that we got our basic moss coat applied to this thing, that's really as far as I think I'm going to go with spray painting this base sculpt. We're going to start by adding extra details that are necessary in this tree, such as foliage and maybe some extra vines or something wrapping around down it, but we're going to make additional sculpts for that. But with that out of the way, I think the very next thing we're going to actually get into is something we never covered in making the winter forest, the leaves. Also, I'm just going to move this thing out of the way a second here. It's not really necessary at the moment, but I will leave it because we may be doing more branches later for different things. So let's get into this foliage by opening modes and sculpt mode. And I think I'll probably just do this maybe with your basic cube. Turn it off of surface snap so we don't get any problems there. I'm going to get into editing the brush and put on variant looseness like I like to do. Kind of flatten this out just a touch and make it into a sort of a rectangle. About like that, and I'm just going to kind of size it maybe so big. We're going to start making like a general leaf cap on this tree. And really what I'm going to do is just kind of go around placing these as if they were leaves. Now, I'm not really thinking of each brick as an individual leaf so much as a cluster of leaves. You got to think kind of impressionistically. I do not attempt to sculpt individual leaves on pretty much any of my plants in Dreams, because Dreams is just not the kind of thing to do that in. Actually, a lot of real stuff, other, AAA games don't really do that either. Most of the time it's texturing on a simple mesh with some alpha maps and stuff to make dense foliage, which you don't really have that luxury in Dreams, unfortunately. So we got to do it our own way, but we'll just time-lapse through this as I set up this general shape of this leaf cap. Also, real quick, something I want to point out right here. The thermo during this process is going to probably jump quite a bit because this is being read as a highly detailed sculpt at the moment, but don't worry too much about that. When you're finished, we're going to be reducing the detail, so it's all going to go back to normal. So we're just going to continue time-lapsing. Okay, so we kind of got our leaf cap going on pretty well there, except of course our thermal is super blown up to 32%, which we cannot have, so we're going to go into the detail tools and we're going to start reducing this right now. And it's only showing purple, but it is the highest purple there is here, so we're going to knock this way, way down. Way, way down. For leaves, I go way down, like really far. Like, see, with leaves it doesn't look so bad. It looks okay. You can lose a lot. Okay, so now we're back to our original 4% on this thermo with this level of detail, so we'll just have it right there. That's pretty good. And I'll get out of the detail editor, and what we'll do now is, before I go any further, I want to open our Foliage Sculptures Tweak menu with L1 square, like so, and just so I don't forget, go straight into physics. We don't need the foliage collidable, and we don't really need an imp interaction. We don't need a medium physics cost either. These are going to be totally out of players' play area, and this is always something I would recommend. Again, I said before, speak with your logician about this, but generally I would put this scenery label on for all your environmental assets. I'm gonna close that tweak menu and get right back into sculpt mode on this and go to work painting. So let's change our tool over to the spray paint and let's get ourselves a nice green foresty color for these leaves. Leaves can sometimes be tricky to get the color for. It's really up to your personal taste or whatever you think is best. But I guess since it's a jungle, we'll try to go for a nice deep kind of green to start out. Kind of me, I like to bring it over a little more towards the gray side, but something like roughly that I think might do pretty well. We'll go ahead with that. And I'll just time-lapse through adding this. Okay, so we've got that nice and green right there, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to probably go in and I'll set this to sphere again and make sure the surface snap is on, and we'll just kind of lighten up that green a bit in a certain way, like so, and I'll just go through and kind of do the outside areas with a little nice soft blend, just to kind of make our tree have some highlight points up there. We'll time-lapse as I do this. Okay, so we've applied all the color I think we need to our foliage sculpt, and now what I'm going to do is open the tweak menu again for that. Oh, excuse me, actually what I'll do is I'll go into modes, and I'll go to style mode. We're going to change the flex here to, I think the dots will serve me well. So we're going to go ahead and change the flex to dot type. Another thing I'm going to do in style mode is I'm going to kind of ruffle it up a bit. Just a bit there on that, so we can get a little more randomness like tree leaves sticking out kind of. And at this point, I'm going to diverge and give some special advice, because I'm going to go in a direction that you may not be able to entirely make do with on a PS4, but which the PS5 does not seem to have a big issue with, and I'm going to explain this. What I want to do is I want to put some extra impasto and looseness to this, because it looks nice. So I'm going to impasto that a little bit right there. See, as you can see, we get more fluff, and just loosen it a bit, like that. And that looks pretty nice, you'd say, right? I think it does. Looks very nice and fluffy for a tree. The problem, though, arises on a PS4. I would used to do this, and this can give you a lot of problems with overdraw, which basically I'm going to get into test mode, and I'm going to give a real quick demonstration in the heat maps. Go to this overdraw. And what happens is you get this, those purple areas, those hot spots, is overdraw, and that comes when you loosen that sculpture flex up like that. And this isn't a huge problem right now with a single tree, but in a whole forest with foliage sculpts and stuff like that, all overlapping, this gets to be a pretty big problem, and it can lead your performance to take a drop. Now, as I said, I haven't had this same issue on a PS5 so far, but I used to have it on PS4, and so generally I would suggest for a PS4, do not do this, just leave it back where we had it previously, as far as impasto and all that. But I'm going to go ahead and do it since I am on the PS5, and my suggestion would be if you're remixing and using this asset on a PS4, you just retract all those settings I added with that, because it might cause you some issues with optimization. But I would say with that, we've got our main jungle tree in commission and ready to go, practically. I want to add a few more details. I think I'm going to go in and sculpt mode and make a little, down here at the base, some vines kind of running up as a separate sculpt for a little more fidelity. I think we can get away with that. Make sure surface snap is on, and I'm gonna go edit and put the varying looseness on. We're also gonna get in and get the curve tool for this, which is nice. Shrink it down, and I'm just gonna kind of run some little vines up and down the base here mostly. They're not gonna probably go all the way up. It's just for the eye level of the player. So I'm gonna time lapse through that. And another thing I think I'll do while I'm making these vines, I might take our big useful brick thing here and I'll just kind of shrink it down, and I'm going to kind of place it in such a way here as to be able to get a sort of a surface to work with to make some vines maybe kind of coming out. And we'll get back into the vine sculpt, and I'll just kind of sculpt along the surface of that like so. And we'll time lapse through this. And there, as you can see, we've got some more fine lines around the base, and I'm going to reduce the detail on those a bit. And with the detail reduced, I'm going to get back into them. We're going to paint them, and I'm just going to probably make a nice white color, just, or light brown, I guess what we got here on this, just generally this. There's not going to be a lot outside just this one color. And we're going to open the tweak menu for our vines. At least I think that's our vines. Let me make sure. Okay, get in there. Make sure the physics is set to non-collidable. Ignore physics cost. Well, and of course we want scenery. I'm going to actually make sure to do this for the tree in the top as well here. Okay, so the base at the top of the tree are set. The only difference from the vines and foliage being that, of course, these are actually collidable because they are large objects in the scene. And now that we got all that set up, I think what I'm going to do is add some extra detail in paint mode, in the way of maybe some extra moss, a few leaves like sticking off the trunk here and there, give it a more jungly effect. So let's go into our modes, enter paint mode, and right away we've got a fleck. I'm going to change our color of our fleck to the moss color, and I'm going to actually modify it so it's slightly brighter, just slightly, so that we've got a little bit brighter on the moss color. And I'm going to make our flecks the leafy dot type flecks. And for this trunk part, we're going to set to surface snap, and I'm just going to kind of brush this with the normal brush set over the surface in certain areas, and I'm going to time lapse as I add that. Now, one thing we don't want to do when we're painting this is we don't want to go past this demarcation point for the upper tree. We just want to stay with the base trunk of the large tree and continue time-lapsing. Okay, so now I think we've got our paint applied to this base trunk in a nice way. I'm going to get into style mode very quickly, and I'm going to turn up the impasto on this just a bit and have it fluff out a tad, and I may go ahead and ruffle it a bit, just a touch. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and enter the painting again. We're going to start a new painting with this button over here. We'll have the same settings and stuff, and I'm going to apply sort of a little bit of the same to the top. Not as much probably as the base. We'll time-lapse through this. Okay, we've got that in place. We've added approximately the same ruffle and impasto settings to the painting on the top part of the tree as well. And one last thing I'm going to do, I'm actually going to get back into the paintings for both these segments, and I'm actually going to go ahead and add manually some special extra, I think impressionist would be good. We're going to turn this off of brush though and go for stamp black. This is going to be very detail oriented. Turn off surface snap for this is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to kind of just take these around certain areas and kind of give the impression of, I don't know, little clinging ferns or something sticking to the outside of the tree in various locations. You kind of see that in the jungle, at least from what I remember. And I might just go ahead and add these mostly to the base, maybe not the upper part, I don't know. But we'll just time-lapse as I go ahead and put these around in various locations. With that, I would venture to say that our jungle's mightiest tree is actually in a pretty good position visually. I'm going to go ahead and delete this puppet now out of the scene, and I don't think we'll need that anymore. And as one last thing I kind of forgot to do that I would like to do to both the base of the tree and the top, I'm going to quickly get into style mode, and we are going to change the fleck type to this impressionist format on both of those. As you can see, that style kind of tends to look a little more vaguely to the eye like bark. I kind of like that. I like that it's got a good tree look. Sometimes, depending on the tree, I'll comb it so it's more vertically oriented. I think though on these jungle trees, having it horizontally oriented seems to work pretty well. So we'll just leave that like that. I'll get into guides and just turn back on the normal lighting. I think with that, our jungle's mightiest tree is pretty much complete. Now, I know at the beginning of the video I said we might do like 3 or 4 trees in this session, but I feel like it's dragged on quite long for this, so what we'll do is we'll actually split that up and I'll do some smaller trees in future segments. And we'll just save this as our primary jungle tree asset for use in our future jungle. When the video releases, I'll definitely be making this asset remixable publicly as well, so you can get in, stamp it out, and do whatever you'd like to look at it or play with it or use it in some kind of game or something. But in the meantime, this has been Billy Cultist. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found this helpful, and will continue to tune in for more of these. We've got more coming up, as I said before. Jimmy's going to continue to release tutorials on making a turn-based RPG combat system. So as I said previously, expect more of those, probably one upcoming weekend. If you like what we do here, we really appreciate it if you subscribe and like. That's one of the most helpful things you can do without spending any money. And if you would like to spend money on us here to help our work, which is one of the super duperest things you can do for us, you can check out our coffee, which is linked in the description. Or alternatively, you might check out our art pal and see some prints you like, or you could get something on a mug. But whatever you do, I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.